Jimmy Bartlett retired from the Yankees in the late 2000s. Now that he was no longer working for Steinbrenner, he no longer went by the name James. Kelly called him Jim, and I called him Dad. But when the two of us would talk to each other about him, we both used to just refer to him simply as Bartlett. Willie Mays played baseball the same time Jimmy Bartlett was a professional hockey player. Mays was a rookie with the Giants when Bartlett was playing juniors, and they both retired in 1973. Mays was famously called the Say Hey Kid. They could have called Bartlett the same thing, because instead of calling people by their names, he would call everybody Hey, like in, Hey, how y'all doing? Or, Hey, what time is it? The reason he called everyone Hey is because he simply didn't know anybody's names. Whenever he introduced any of his friends to my mom, he would always tell them to say hello to Kelly. He would never say their names. And now, it wasn't a memory problem. I would show him old team pictures, and he could always name every teammate on the roster. But his friends and the people he worked with every day during the time he was employed by Steinbrenner and the Yankees, he had no idea. They were all, Hey. Bartlett didn't know the name of most celebrities or politicians either. Most of the time, he would just refer to everyone generically as that asshole. Jimmy would read the sports page every day. It would drive me crazy that he would always mispronounce two of the greatest hockey players' names of all time. He always called Patrick Waugh Patrick Roy, and Jaromir Jagr was always Jagger. It took a lot longer than it should have for me to realize what in hindsight should have been obvious all along. My dad didn't forget people's names. He never knew them, because he couldn't hear. He would read lips and use little tricks and was really good at faking it the best he could. But as he got older, his hearing got progressively worse. Hearing aids never worked, but if you looked at him and spoke slowly and very loudly, he had no problem communicating. But if you didn't look him in the eye or spoke too quickly, he would just say, Huh? It would drive his wife Kelly crazy. Huh? Because she always forgot this simple rule to her great frustration. Huh? Of course, Bartlett loved to drive her crazy, so he would always throw in a couple extra, huh, just for fun. But she never learned. Just look him in the eye, speak loudly, speak slowly. I remember one year my mom was preparing Thanksgiving dinner and asked my dad if he was finished carving the turkey. He just gave her a deadpan look and said, Gobble, 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 gobble. She asked him again, Gobble, 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 gobble. And again. Each time her voice would get louder and she would get angrier as she got more and more frustrated. Gobble, 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 gobble. It was hilarious watching him push her buttons. I have no idea how long Jimmy was hearing impaired. When the Baltimore Clippers lost Game 1 of the Calder Cup semifinals on April 16, 1967 to the Rochester Americans in triple overtime, Jimmy's potential game-winning goal was easily stopped by Bobby Perreault. Jimmy told the press afterwards that he failed to shoot the puck hard because he mistakenly thought he heard the whistle blow the play dead. So who really knows? After my grandmother died, my older sister Melinda moved down to Tampa Bay from Rhode Island in 2008 into her old house. That same year, Barack Obama was sworn in as the 44th President of the United States. Obama first achieved fame with the publishing of his autobiography, Dreams from My Father. In his memoir, Obama wrote about the challenges growing up biracial and how his pilgrimage to Kenya allowed him to better understand his heritage. I never had to travel overseas in order to understand my heritage or my father's dreams, because my dad lived his dreams, and the only other thing he wanted was for me to be able to live mine. Like the kid in the Bill Murray movie St. Vincent, I learned quite a few things when my dad used to take me to the track. Why waste $2 buying a program? $2 is a bet. Instead, just grab one from the trash can. And speaking of the trash, later on when a law professor asked me in class what a person should do if they ever won 10 grand at the track, I immediately knew that the correct answer was to go dumpster diving for losing tickets to offset the winnings. And when I was a kid, my dad used to love to tell me the story of the old bull and the young bull standing on the hill looking down at the field of cows. The young bull says to the old bull, "Let's run down and screw one of the cows." The wise old bull shakes his head no and says, "Let's walk down and screw them all." Actually, I learned the importance of efficiency and the conservation of energy from that little bit of advice. I'll also remember the time when I was still a kid. I guess I was 7 or 8 years old or something. And the whole family went to a restaurant in Maryland called Friendly Farms. It was during the summer, so Melinda and JJ were there with us. JJ ordered a delicious roast beef dinner. Bartlett reached over to his plate and tried to take a bite, but JJ blocked him by taking his own fork and stabbing the piece on the plate. I'll always remember what my dad said. He told JJ that a child should never begrudge their parents because your parents give you everything your entire life. My dad was always trying to teach me how to be street smart, how to hide your money in hotel rooms and stuff like that. But the most important thing I ever learned from my father was never to be afraid to be yourself. Nobody could ever tell Bartlett how to play hockey or how to live his life. Nobody's going to tell me that I can't make a 17-part documentary about my dad. And if I want to sing The Summer Wind and The Age of Aquarius off-key, I'm going to do it. And anybody who's offended that The Legend of Black Bart contains my own personal liberal views on history and politics can just kiss my ass. I'm not the only son of a hockey player to ever make a documentary about his father. In 2010, Don Cherry's son, Tim Cherry, wrote the screenplay for Keep Your Head Up, Kid, the Don Cherry story. Jared Keeso, who later starred in Shoresy and Letterkenny, won the Canadian equivalent of the Emmy Award as Best Actor in a Television Movie for his portrayal of the controversial hockey legend. Jimmy Bartlett is actually played by an actor in the movie and is portrayed as a villain. In the film, during a game between the Providence Reds and the Hershey Bears, Bartlett viciously runs a player into the boards by the Hershey bench and throws a cocky smirk towards Cherry. When they're finally on the ice together, Cherry and Bartlett immediately drop the gloves and start swinging as soon as the puck drops. In the next scene, after getting his butt kicked by Bartlett, when Cherry shows up to dinner to meet his future in-laws for the first time, he has a black eye and numerous cuts and bruises all over his face. By this time, Melinda's 3 children, Deanna, Tiffany, and Patrick, were now adults. Her oldest daughter, Deanna, was a gifted chef and had her own bakery. The middle child, Tiffany, was a married school teacher. The youngest, Patrick, had a 1-1 record in the octagon where he fought as a mixed martial artist before his girlfriend and future wife wisely convinced him to hang up the gloves. Tiffany was really close with her grandparents. She still calls and talks to my mother on a weekly basis. She, her husband Ryan, and her 2 children would regularly come down to Florida from Rhode Island to visit with my mom and dad. Bartlett was now a great-grandparent. The kids called him Gramps and my mother Gigi. Tiffany and Ryan are huge die-hard obnoxious sports fans of New England sports teams. I think I remember them mentioning Tom Brady's name once or twice. Although her mother Melinda was now living in Florida, she never became a Tampa Bay Lightning fan. She actually cheered for the Bruins when we watched them eliminate the Lightning in Game 7 of the 2011 Eastern Conference Finals over at my parents' house. Unlike Tiffany, Melinda couldn't name a single player on the team. Besides our dad, the only other Bruin she ever heard of was Bobby Orr. What a poser. My older brother JJ and his wife also eventually migrated to Florida from New England as well. However, we never saw them that often because nothing was ever the same after that summer when JJ decided at the last moment to remain with his mother in Providence instead of living with us full-time in Baltimore. My dad was devastated by JJ's choice. However, instead of accepting his decision and moving on, he couldn't just let it go. Instead, every time they spoke to each other on the phone, my dad would always rant about his ex-wife and how JJ ruined his life by making the worst decision of his life, and the conversation would always just deteriorate into an argument. As a result, Jay stopped visiting, and he would only call on Christmas and birthdays. I completely understand why JJ wouldn't want to keep hearing his father repeatedly badmouth his mother. My mom and I both tried to encourage my dad to just let it go, but for some reason he just couldn't. But nothing hurt my dad as much as when we learned that JJ had legally changed his last name to Laughlin, the surname of his stepfather. My dad took this as the ultimate betrayal. He told me that he now only had one son. My mom and I both told him that JJ would always be his son. It's just the name. I completely understood why Jay wouldn't want to be the only Bartlett in a family full of Laughlins. My dad should have been happy that Jay had such a close, loving relationship with his stepfather. It didn't mean that JJ didn't love his father, but my dad just couldn't overcome his pride and jealousy. It wasn't JJ's fault that he had to grow up in Rhode Island after Bartlett was traded to the Baltimore Clippers. The true villain was ice hockey. When Bartlett was traded to Baltimore before the 1966 season, he had to leave J.J. and Melinda behind in Providence if he wanted to continue in his chosen livelihood. Professional athletes have to go wherever they're sent. The business of sports can be cruel. Yes, Bartlett did have a choice. He could have abandoned his dream and retired from hockey and remained in Providence, but he didn't. Bartlett turned 80 in 2012. He and my mother were both retired, living in their Tampa Bay home. He would swim in the pool and putter around the yard or the house, but most of the time he was playing comfortably on the sofa watching television. On his lap was his constant companion, his little Yorkie Teddy. To help him hear better, he would watch television while wearing large headphones. I couldn't believe that he used to like to watch the lame reality show The Bachelor. Why in the world would Black Bart ever want to watch the rose ceremony? I like to check out the young broads. They're really fucking nice. But normally he would just watch sports. He enjoyed one channel that had horse races simulcast from around the country, and he would watch football or his beloved Yankees, and all the Tampa Bay Lightning games were televised. During the 1970s and 80s, Bartlett hated hockey. He was jealous because the NHL's rapid expansion from the original 6 made millionaires out of players who never would have even made it into the American League 30 years earlier. But once Tampa Bay was awarded a team, Jimmy became a Tampa Bay Lightning fan. I knew a doctor who would invite me and my dad several times each year to his luxury suite at Amalie Arena to catch some games. My dad and I were always the first to arrive, so for a while we would just have the suite to ourselves, and we would pig out on all the free food and free beer. And of course, my dad would wear his championship Yankees ring. Everyone would stop to gawk at it and would want to try it on or have their pictures taken with it. Watching hockey with my dad was a trip. He would always just matter-of-factly call the penalties before the referee would. He never reminisced about scoring any big goals or winning any big games. Instead, he just loved to talk about how he fucking nailed everybody. When I asked him whether an old hockey player was any good, he would normally say, he wasn't a fighter. Nothing else seemed to matter to him. During the game, whenever players would jaw at one another, Bartlett would refer to it as a yeah fight. Like, I'm going to kick your ass. Oh yeah? Yeah. All talk, no action. But when it comes time to a real fight, there's no warning, there's no talking. You just take them out, just like the mafia. He said he used to practice how to barely dangle his hockey glove off his fingers so he can easily flick it off and throw a punch in one motion. He hated dump and chase hockey, and it would drive him crazy when the Lightning would be on the power play, and instead of shooting, they would keep passing the puck, looking for the perfect shot in order to score a beautiful goal. If you shoot the puck, you can get a rebound. It doesn't matter if the goal's ugly, it still counts. And he always loved to complain about how modern goalies wouldn't be so brave without all their padding and goalie masks. He thought the modern goalies were all gutless. My wife and I went over to my parents' house one Sunday in January 2013. My wife was amazed when my dad gave her an assortment of photos that he had cut out of a magazine and saved for her of potential dresses that Michelle Obama might choose to wear for the upcoming inauguration ball for her husband, who had just been re-elected president. I jokingly wanted to know who kidnapped my dad and replaced him with Tim Gunn from Project Runaway. But Bartlett didn't give a shit what people thought about him. He would happily wear the bright pink clothes his wife would buy for him. He was 100% comfortable with who he was and never felt the need to prove his masculinity. The Rhode Island Reds Heritage Society was formed in 2001 to honor and to preserve the team's history. Each year, the Heritage Society would host a reunion in Providence for the old players and their fans. Jim and Kelly attended several of the reunions. One year, while the reunion was being held at the home of the son of former goalie Harvey Bennett, the party merged with an extravagant outdoor birthday party being held directly across the street at a multimillionaire's home on Narragansett Beach. Music superstar Sting performed at the private beach party. On August 3, 2014, Jimmy received the Rhode Island Reds Heritage Society's Topps Award. The Topps Award was named in honor of the great Zelio Topazzini and was given each year to the ex-player or employee who has exemplified a love of hockey, public service, and a dedication to the Reds. My mom and dad, my wife and I, and my sister all flew to Providence for the weekend. Because Melinda's 3 adult children all lived in Rhode Island, Deanna, Tiffany, and Patrick, their spouses, and several of their kids also came. Dozens of former Providence Reds players attended as well. My dad introduced me to the legendary goaltender Johnny Bower. Bartlett scored more goals in his NHL career against the China Wall than any other goalie. I also met Bruce Klein, who beat my dad out for the AHL's Rookie of the Year. Bruce was a teammate of Bartlett on both of his Calder Cup winning teams, the 1956 Providence Reds and the 1960 Springfield Indians. Don McKenney was there, who was the Boston Bruins star player when Bartlett played his final season in the NHL. And my mom and I hung out with Howie Menard on the day of our flight home. Howie assisted on all 3 of Bartlett's goals when Jimmy had the hat trick in his first game back during his famous 1972 comeback, and still holds the AHL record for most points in a playoff game when he scored 4 goals and had 3 assists in the Baltimore Clippers' 10-1 blowout win over the Cleveland Barons. The engraving on the Topps Award presented to Bartlett referred to him as the heart and soul of the great Reds teams of the 1950s. It described him as an extremely popular player. He was feisty, aggressive, and always willing to drop the gloves. Jim's aggressive play endeared him to the fans of Providence. At the Topps ceremony, they raised Bartlett's number to the rafters. His acceptance speech got a huge laugh when he said, "After I retired, I moved to Tampa Bay, and I got a great job as a driver for George Steinbrenner, owner of the New York Yankees. I'm the only person who ever lived who worked for both George Steinbrenner and Eddie Shore, 2 of the kindest, most understanding, and patient bosses that a guy could ever wish for." The ceremony was given a lot of media coverage in Providence, and a televised interview with Bartlett was broadcast on the local news. Jimmy told the interviewer that he was deaf in one ear and he can't hear out of the other. He was described by the Providence Journal as being as much of a character now as he was during his years playing for the Reds. Jimmy reminisced about his days playing for the Providence Reds to the reporter. "The fans were really good. We used to get a full house in the auditorium every Sunday night. It was old-time hockey. We had a chicken wire fence. They didn't have glass. If a guy got you tied up against the boards, fans would throw something in his face, a beer or something. You go back to the bench smelling like beer." Ross Brooks, former backup goalie for the Reds, told the Journal that Jimmy was a crazy guy to say the least. In those days, there were players you stayed away from a little bit. They were a little wacky. You didn't know if they were going to hit you over the head or not. Jimmy was one of those guys. For a birthday present that year, my mom got my dad and me tickets to see Bartlett's all-time favorite musical artist in concert. So on October 23, 2014, my dad and I went to Ruth Eckerd Hall in Clearwater and saw Ringo Starr's all-star band. My dad's favorite musical artist was not the Beatles. He just loved Ringo. Although his hearing was severely limited, this didn't stop him from getting into the music. He got a kick out of the way Ringo would shake his head when playing the drums. Bartlett liked singing Yellow Submarine and With a Little Help from My Friends and Ringo's No-No song. But his absolute favorite was when Ringo sang the song Boys off of the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. As I get older, the lyric of Ringo's biggest solo hit, Photograph, becomes more and more poignant. "Every time I see your face, it reminds me of the places we used to go. But all I've got is a photograph, and I realize you're not coming back anymore." In May 2015, Melinda moved out of my grandmother's house and moved away to Texas with her boyfriend. When Jay came over to retrieve a couple of pieces of furniture that she had left behind, he and my dad actually had a brief reconciliation and expressed their love for one another. That was the last time I ever saw my brother. He had cancer. Jay died on January 6, 2017. He was only 55. My dad never talked about it, but then again, my dad never really discussed his inner feelings much. Aristotle once said that a friend to everyone is a friend to no one. Even though everyone loved Bartlett and he was a fun-loving guy who was friendly with everybody, in reality, he never had any really close, intimate friends. He never shared his deepest thoughts or made himself emotionally vulnerable to anyone. As his hearing got worse, my dad became quieter as he got older. I can just assume that he spent a lot of his time reflecting on his long and exciting life and legacy. Jimmy Bartlett started skating as soon as he could walk, and as soon as he could skate, the English lad from Montreal started playing ice hockey. As a kid, he played pee-wee, bantam, and midget hockey, and then played for the Verdun high school team. Despite being so poor that he could not afford proper equipment and used old magazines and rolled up newspapers for pads, Jimmy was still able to impress the pro scouts who made him the property of the Montreal Canadiens. Jimmy was only 17 in 1949 when he played 6 games for the Verdun Maple Leafs of the Junior Amateur Hockey Association, which had changed its names to the Quebec Junior Hockey League. Verdun was coached by the Hockey Hall of Fame defenseman Silvio Mantha, who took Bartlett under his wing. Jimmy never played college hockey. Like most players of his day, he got his hockey education playing junior hockey. In 1950, the Verdun Maple Leafs were renamed the La Salles, and Jimmy played juniors against future superstars Jean Beliveau, Bernie Geoffrion, and Dickie Moore. At the time, Jimmy was a hard-hitting defenseman who would lead the rush into the offensive zone. The loose cannon was suspended in the first month of the season and was later given a severe reprimand from the league president, who warned him that his rough tactics would no longer be tolerated. In 1951, Verdun became the St. Jerome Eagles, and Bartlett gained the reputation as the dirtiest player in the league. Jimmy and fiery Phil Watson, the coach of the Quebec Citadels, were both suspended after they spit in each other's faces during an on-ice altercation. That season, Jimmy broke the league record for penalty minutes. He also broke the record for most goals scored in a season by a defenseman and was named the second-team All-Star. After the Eagles season ended, Jimmy was assigned to the semi-pro Boston Olympics of the Eastern Hockey League for 16 games, where he was compared to Hall of Fame defenseman Kenny Reardon. The following year, Jimmy and the QJHL's MVP Donnie Marshall were both assigned to the Cincinnati Mohawks of the International League. The Mohawks were coached by Hall of Famer Buddy O'Connor, who converted Jimmy into a left winger. Bartlett scored 32 goals as the mighty Mohawks won their first of 5 consecutive Turner Cup championships. The Mohawks then defeated the Eastern League's Johnstown Jets in a tournament and won the United States Senior Amateur Hockey Championship. However, after Jimmy was suspended for 2 games by his own team because of a deliberate intent to injure an opponent, Montreal Canadiens hockey executive Kenny Reardon punished Bartlett by sending him to play senior hockey the following season instead of promoting him to the pros with many of his Cincinnati teammates. Bartlett scored 43 goals and won the Lower St. Lawrence Hockey League's 1953 championship with the semi-pro Matane Red Rocks. Jimmy finished second in the league in both scoring and goals and led the league in penalty minutes. Matane then defeated the Cornwall Colts in the Provincial Senior League and won the Quebec Senior Playoffs. In the Allen Cup Senior Eastern Hockey Championship Tournament, Matane swept the Maritime Provinces champions, the Fredericton Capitals, in 4 straight in the semifinals before they were eliminated in the finals by the Ontario champions, the Sudbury Wolves. Jimmy had 25 points in the 16 games that Matane played in this prestigious tournament. Jimmy was given the nickname The Terror and led his club in penalty minutes while playing for the 1954-1955 Chicoutimi Saguenayens. He finished 6th in the Quebec Hockey League in goals in his first year as a pro when he lit the lamp 28 times in only 58 games. Bartlett's aggressive play impressed the coach of the Montreal Canadiens, Dick Irvin. Jimmy was called up to the Habs for a 2-game cup of coffee. Jimmy found the back of the net in his NHL debut against the Chicago Blackhawks, but the goal against Al Rollins was waved off because the Canadiens were offside. When the legend, Maurice the Rocket Richard, was suspended for the remainder of the season after he hit a referee, which resulted in the infamous Richard Riot, Coach Dick Irvin called up Jimmy Bartlett from the Chicks as his replacement for the Stanley Cup Finals. Although the Canadiens lost to Gordie Howe's Red Wings, Bartlett was still able to live the dream by playing in his hometown in the Stanley Cup Finals at the Montreal Forum in front of his friends and family. Bartlett was shocked when he was poached by the New York Rangers in the 1955 Intra-League Draft. Although he drove him crazy, Phil Watson, the Rangers' new coach, secretly admired the volatile young winger because he reminded him of himself. Jimmy was the last player cut from training camp when he was assigned to the Providence Reds of the American Hockey League. Jimmy scored his first NHL point when the Rangers called him and Providence Reds defenseman Aldo Guidolin up for a 12-game stint. In a game against the Canadiens, Boom Boom Geoffrion refused to fight Bartlett, but instead threw his equipment all over the ice and yelled at him in French, calling him vous crazy, after Jimmy threatened to take his ear off with his stick. Bartlett scored 28 goals in 50 games, and the Providence Reds won the Calder Cup in Jimmy's first year playing in the AHL. The pugilistic winger was given the nickname Rocky during his time with the Reds, where he played again the following season after a crappy training camp with the Rangers. In a game against the Springfield Indians, Bartlett caused a riot after he was arrested following the game because he hit a heckling fan in the head with his hockey stick. Although the Reds finished in first place, they lost in the first rounds of the playoffs. Jimmy failed to make the Rangers the following season because he was sick with the flu during training camp. However, he showed the pride of Providence when he scored 2 goals in a record 5 seconds in a game against Rochester in which he scored 4 times. In 1958, Bartlett finally made it to Broadway, and he played the entire season for the New York Rangers. He scored his first goal against Mr. Goalie Glenn Hall and broke the Rangers' record for most penalty minutes by a forward in a season. When he was with the Rangers, he and fellow rookie Eddie Shack were given the nicknames Nuts and Bolts by Hall of Fame winger Andy Bathgate. Jimmy's colorful disposition combined with his entertaining goal celebration dances led to Bartlett being given the nickname Crazy Horse by the New York media. The Rangers choked and collapsed at the end of the season and missed the playoffs. After the season, the Rangers and Boston Bruins played in an historic series of exhibition matches in various cities throughout Europe. Bobby Hull played for the New York Rangers and was the only Ranger to score more goals on the tour than Jimmy Bartlett. The following year, Jimmy fired 3 consecutive goals past Toronto's Johnny Bower for the NHL's only natural hat trick that season. No New York Ranger would have another natural hat trick for another 8 years. Jimmy also became the first Ranger to have his own fan club. This fan club continued to follow Jimmy no matter what team he played for and hosted an annual banquet in his honor. Nevertheless, after Phil Watson was fired and screamed mutiny, and the loyal Bartlett badmouthed his replacement Alf Pike to the press, the popular winger was banished to the dreaded Eddie Shore and his Springfield Indians. Jimmy was the hero who scored the game-winning goal against the Providence Reds that sent Springfield to the Calder Cup Finals. But after Bartlett scored in the first game of the finals against Rochester, Eddie Shore benched Jimmy for the final 3 games of the playoffs as the Indians won the first of 3 consecutive championships. Bartlett was rescued from hockey hell when he was poached by the Boston Bruins in the intra-league draft. The Boys of Beantown were a historically bad team. What the team lacked in talent was made up in character, as it remained united in support of teammate Willie O'Ree, who became the first black hockey player to score an NHL goal on January 1, 1961. In the final NHL game of his career, Bartlett fought the biggest player in the league, Moose Vasco. Despite scoring 15 goals and leading the Bruins in penalty minutes, Jimmy was sold to the Providence Reds after Boston finished in last place. Jimmy hit his peak after new coach Fernie Flaman created the famous B line of Stan Balouk, Jimmy Bartlett, and Pierre Briand, which dominated the Reds' scoring over the next 3 seasons. Jimmy scored 31 goals in 1961, but the Reds were eliminated in the first round of the playoffs by Willie Marshall and the Hershey Bears. Jimmy had the most points in his AHL career the following season, despite a serious stick-to-the-eye injury that threatened to end his career. In 1963, the Reds added Willie Marshall, but were still eliminated from the playoffs in the first round for the 3rd year in a row, despite Bartlett's 26 goals. After the B line split up following Stan Balouk's retirement, Jimmy led the Providence Reds in scoring for the 1964-65 season. After a disappointing 65 season, in which the Reds finished in last place, Jimmy was traded to the Baltimore Clippers in a blockbuster deal along with Willie Marshall and Aldo Guidolin. Jimmy Bartlett is the 5th all-time leading scorer for the Providence Reds. Only Zelio Topazzini and Paul Larrivee scored more goals than Jimmy in a Reds uniform. And Jimmy Bartlett also remains the all-time Providence Reds leader in penalty minutes. The Clippers were coached by Kenny Reardon's brother Terry, who had been the general manager for Providence when he previously bought Jimmy from Boston. Jimmy heard the fight song Win You Baltimore Clippers played many times after he arrived in Baltimore in 1966, where he scored 30 times and Baltimore made it past the first round of the playoffs for the first time in the team's existence. Black Bart scored 22 times the following season after the Clippers roster was decimated by the NHL expansion draft, primarily playing on the off wing and at center after Willie Marshall broke his ankle on Christmas Eve. Despite not playing on a regular line and only being used sparingly because new coach Aldo Guidolin and the team felt pressured to play younger prospects, Bartlett still found the back of the net 25 times the following year. Jimmy bid farewell to the 1960s by leading the 1969 Clippers in both scoring and with his 30 goals. However, after Jimmy's disappointing 1970 season, the team cut him the following year after training camp. Refusing to go gentle into the night, Bartlett returned to the amateur ranks by playing 14 games for the Columbus Seals in the International League. After the Seals failed to win a single game, Jimmy simply walked away from the team and returned home to Baltimore. With the team needing help due to injuries at the end of the season, Bartlett made a spectacular comeback, scoring 8 goals in 11 games and leading the team to the Calder Cup Finals, where they were defeated by the Nova Scotia Voyagers. Jimmy was almost 41 years old when he scored 24 goals in his final season with the Baltimore Clippers. It was the 12th time that he had scored more than 20 goals in the AHL. However, he was unceremoniously cut on the last day of training camp the following season, ending his professional career. He retired as the Clippers' all-time leader in goals scored. He is now second in career Clipper goals behind Bobby Rivard and is fourth on the all-time Clippers scoring list. Jimmy also spent more time in the penalty box than any other Clipper forward. After being reinstated to amateur status, Jimmy was the league's best player and won 4 consecutive Chesapeake League championships, playing for the National Brewers until he finally hung up the skates for good in 1978. Jimmy later was a member of the Yankees staff for 5 World Series championship teams. Jimmy Bartlett's 360 career goals placed him number 6 on the American Hockey League's all-time goal-scoring list when he played his final game in 1973. In the more than 50 years since he stopped playing, only 3 other players have scored more goals than Bartlett. Rochester's Jody Gage passed him on the all-time list in 1990. Former Bear and skipjack Mitch Lamoureux did so in 1998, and Hershey great Alexander Giroux passed Bartlett in 2011. That's it. As of 2024, Jimmy remains 9th all-time in American Hockey League goals scored. Wayne Gretzky is just one of many players who have scored more goals in the NHL than Bartlett has. But there's only one player in hockey's long history to have scored more goals than Jimmy Bartlett in both the American and National Hockey Leagues. Only one. And that was the great Rochester American, Dick Gamble. In late 2017, Jimmy received a telephone call from his old teammate Bruce Klein, who he had known since 1950 when they both were still playing junior hockey. Bruce called to inform his old buddy that he was being inducted into the American Hockey League Hall of Fame. The induction ceremony was held on January 29, 2018 at the Turning Stone Resort Casino in Utica, New York, and was part of the AHL's All-Star Game weekend festivities. The league gave the Bartlett family total VIP treatment. The AHL not only paid for my parents' airfare and a week-long stay at the resort, the league also did the same thing for me and my wife. My dad was being inducted along with 3 other players. Don Biggs may have been Patrick Swayze's skating double in the 1986 movie Youngblood. But in 1992, he broke the AHL record for points in the season when he had an astonishing 54 goals and 84 assists. Biggs then finished his career playing 5 years where Bartlett began his, with Cincinnati in the International League. Glenn Murkowski won 3 Calder Cups playing left wing during the 1980s. Glenn scored more than 20 goals in each of the 10 seasons he spent in the American Hockey League, mostly with the Adirondack Red Wings. Finally, the league inducted Bartlett's former teammate on Eddie Shore's Springfield Indians, Brian Killer Kilray. Brian had already been inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto as a builder, as the greatest coach in the history of junior hockey. But now he was being inducted as a player. Brian led the Springfield Indians in scoring 3 times and helped them three-peat as champions during the early 1960s. My mom asked me to write an acceptance speech for my dad. The night before we flew to New York, my dad and I practiced the speech. Then we performed a little dress rehearsal for my mom. It was my idea to perform a practical joke on her, but my dad was always happy to torture his loving wife, so we played along. I pretended to be the master of ceremonies and handed him a fake award. For the entire speech, all he was supposed to do was raise his right fist in the air and simply say, "Black Lives Matter." But Bartlett improvised by adding after "Black Lives Matter," "Get Trump out of there." My mom's jaw dropped open. "You can't let your father say that." "Why not? He'll be a liberal hero." "You can't let him do that. He'll probably go viral." Nobody would expect an 84-year-old hockey player to say that. They'll play it over and over again on MSNBC. They probably get him to say "Live from New York" it's Saturday night. Oh man, she lost it. But we had her going for quite a while before we let her know we were just pulling her leg. We were given front row seats for the All-Star Game skills competition and for the All-Star Game. We traveled with the All-Star Players team on the bus on both nights to the Utica Memorial Auditorium, where the AHL's Comets played and where the classic movie Slapshot was filmed. During the bus ride to the auditorium, I talked to Brian Kilray, who told me that all of the stories I heard about Eddie Shore were true. Some of the players on the bus were surprised when they heard me repeat one of Bartlett's favorite expressions: "If you're anywhere near the net when the puck goes in, make sure you put your stick in the air." Because teamwork and self-sacrifice is repeatedly drilled into players' heads the moment they first learn to skate, Bartlett's self-aggrandizing quotes and his famous post-goal celebrations is probably a little bit out of step with current hockey culture. The night before my dad's induction, my mom told me that she didn't feel like he was capable of giving the speech that I had written for him. His health had been deteriorating, and he was feeling a bit overwhelmed. I knew he had trouble hearing, but otherwise he seemed fine to me. But my mother insisted that, contrary to what I may have thought, my dad was getting more and more difficult to take care of. When I asked him what he wanted to do, he told me that he would rather have me give his acceptance speech. I never really recognized my dad's decline until the day of his induction into the Hall of Fame. After he put on his suit, he asked me to do something for him that broke my heart. He asked me to tie his necktie for him because he had forgotten how to do it. My dad was the one who taught me how to tie a Windsor knot. He tied ties his entire life. And once you showed Bartlett something, you never had to show him a second time. I thought my mom had been exaggerating his decline, but now I realize that my mother was right. A video tribute was played immediately before his induction. Gene Ubriaco was a teammate of Bartlett's for 6 games in 1967, but was his opponent for 6 seasons before that.
Imagine for 20 seasons, Jimmy averaged over 60 games per season. He scored, put points on the board, and as an opponent, with the scars to prove it, he played really hard.
And Bartlett got his own Coach's Corner segment on Hockey Night in Canada as Don Cherry described being on the losing end of a hockey fight.
I remember we had a fight in Providence, and it was a beauty fight. I'd just come back, and I'm telling you, he hit me so many times with a right, I was begging for a left. And he really was a good fighter. And you know what? What I like about him is that he could skate, he could fly. I think he even served some time with Shore at the time, but this was something. I remember one time he got 2 goals in 4 seconds. It was unbelievable. This guy, and he did them all in Providence. That's where I remember.
There was no way in hell I was going to say the same old boring generic thank you speech you've heard a million times before. Hockey's colorful outlaw deserved much better than that. I explained to the audience that the reason I was giving the speech instead of my dad was because he was a lover and a fighter, not a talker, and that if he wanted to, he could still beat my ass in a New York minute. In my speech, I said that my dad felt insulted by the very first sentence of his video tribute.
Never a flashy scorer or high-profile superstar, Jim Bartlett spent the majority of his 21-year professional career in the American Hockey League. and was one of the most consistent performers of his era.
Jimmy Bartlett was never a flashy, high-scoring superstar. Really? You try telling that to my dad. In his mind, he was the biggest star to ever put on a pair of skates. After all, he is 9th all-time in goals scored, and those goals didn't score themselves. He led the Reds and the Clippers in scoring even when they had Willie Marshall. And anyone who knocks himself unconscious after skating into the boards during a post-goal celebration dance has got to be considered to be at least a little bit flashy, right? But after thinking about it for a while, I realized the video was right. Maybe he really wasn't a flashy, high-scoring superstar. Bartlett never was named league MVP. He never led the league in scoring or in goals. Jimmy Bartlett never won Rookie of the Year. He was never even named a first-team or second-team All-Star. In fact, Jimmy Bartlett never received any awards at all in the American Hockey League. But there was one thing that Jimmy Bartlett was called in every single hockey program and newspaper article. He was always referred to as a fan favorite. And you know what? He would rather be called a fan favorite than to have won a bunch of awards, because the game of hockey belongs to the fans, not to the owners, the coaches, or even the players, and nobody should ever forget that. Jimmy was always grateful for the support fans gave him, and he was always happy to sign an autograph or pose for a picture. Now, the reason why Bartlett was so popular was because he wasn't afraid of anybody. If someone gave one of his teammates a cheap shot, there would be hell to pay, and he would really nail them. And because they knew that he had their backs, Willie Marshall and Zelio Topazzini were free to be flashy, high-scoring superstars. I talked about how the AHL and NHL had the same awards, they just have different names. The Most Valuable Player Award is the Hart in the NHL, but it's the Cunningham in the AHL. However, there was one NHL award that had no AHL equivalent, the unofficial Gordie Howe hat trick. The crowd really liked my suggestion that whenever someone has a goal, an assist, and a fight in an American Hockey League game, it should be referred to as a Jimmy Bartlett hat trick. Finally, I argued that when people discuss who is the greatest hockey player of all time, the answer depends on how you define greatness. If you look at the value of a player during their entire career, then the answer is definitely either Gordie Howe or Wayne Gretzky. But maybe a player's peak is what defines greatness. Bobby Orr had a very short career, but he led the league in scoring as a defenseman. So if peak greatness is defined as to whoever had the best season, then the answer is either Bobby Orr or Gretzky or Mario Lemieux. But why stop at a season? Maybe we should look at who had the greatest single game. Darryl Sittler once had 10 points in a game, so maybe the great Maple Leaf had the greatest peak. Maybe we should narrow it down to a single period. Brian Trottier once had 6 points in a single period. But if you want to look at a player's absolute peak, let's narrow it down even further. In other words, a peak moment. In 1958, Jimmy Bartlett once scored 2 goals in 5 seconds. Gretzky never scored 2 goals in 5 seconds. Neither did Rocket Richard, Gordie Howe, Mario Lemieux, Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin, Bobby Orr, or Connor McDavid. So it can be argued that at his absolute peak, Jimmy Bartlett was the flashiest high-scoring superstar the world of hockey had ever seen. At which point the crowd roared its approval. I was so proud of my dad, and I am forever grateful that I got to share that moment with him. After the ceremony, I was approached by Hockey Hall of Famer Mark Howe, who was in attendance with his son, who told me how much he loved my speech, especially the part about the Jimmy Bartlett hat trick, becoming the Gordie Howe hat trick of the American Hockey League. Also in attendance were the Mattingly brothers, Jimmy's old teammates from his days with the National Brewers. Dave Mattingly flew in all the way from Germany to be there. They paid homage to an old photograph they had taken years earlier with a new picture with Bartlett and one of their sons filling in for their dad, former Brewer coach Sam Mattingly. We attended the All-Star game the night after Bartlett's induction. When we got to the rink, someone asked us if my dad wanted to go down to the dressing room before the game. Brian Kilray promised me that he would keep an eye on him, so off they went. 30 minutes later, the game was about to start, and my mom and I had no idea where Bartlett was, and we were beginning to worry. Just then, it was announced over the PA that new American League Hockey Hall of Famer Jimmy Bartlett would be dropping the ceremonial puck, and there he was out on the ice in front of thousands of screaming fans. When he came back to us, he was more excited than he was during his induction ceremony. He said he had so much fun telling old stories to all of the players in the dressing room. For one brief moment, while hanging with the guys and soaking in all the cheers, Jimmy Bartlett was young again. Bartlett used to tell his famous hello dolly jokes at parties. I was going to do an impression of my dad's voice and retell his old joke in his unique style, but I figured, what's the point? My impression doesn't really do him justice anyway. Hey, I never claimed to be Rich Little. During most of his life, he spoke faster and higher than I do it in my impression anyway. When telemarketers would call, he would pretend to be the lady of the house or a child or the maid. But that's not the point. The truth is that no matter how hard I try to preserve my dad's memory by attempting to replicate his voice, the more I realize how futile my efforts are. Bartlett would have people in stitches as he would sing off key when telling that old joke. Not because the punchline was that funny, but because of his personality. My impression is nothing but a poor forgery. Jimmy Bartlett had a magnetism that had to be experienced in order to be understood. All of my attempts to describe his charisma has been as futile as trying to describe a sunset to a blind man. Bartlett has remained popular in the hearts of fans even though he last played more than 50 years ago. I still hear from fans who tell me that he was their hockey hero when they were kids growing up in Baltimore, Providence, New York, and Boston. There's a reason why for many years he had his own personal fan club that followed and supported him no matter where he was playing. And it wasn't because of the stats that made him a fan favorite, it was because of who he was. Although I have spent countless hours researching and creating this project, I consider The Legend of Black Bart to be a failure. And that's because, no matter how hard I try, I cannot capture my father's essence. I will always regret that I failed to make The Legend of Black Bart many years ago with my dad. I may have known the stats and the dates, but Jimmy Bartlett actually lived his stories. I should have interviewed him on camera so he could have told his own life story instead of filtering it through me. He could have shared his opinion about the players and provided tons of details. And more importantly, instead of me droning on and on for hours, it would have been told in his own voice, with his own words, in his own hilariously vulgar way. And that would have made The Legend of Black Bart truly something special. But I dropped the ball, and that opportunity is gone forever. And so are 99% of his stories, which will be forever forgotten. But at least I preserved some of them, which I guess is better than nothing. But that's the funny thing about memories. The passage of time always destroys most of them. Following a sports team is like watching a real-life soap opera. Each season tells an epic story with a huge cast interacting with each other. And each game is like an episode with its own plot. Heroes and villains, losers and winners. Nobody remembers the details of every game or every goal during a season. The drama and excitement of each individual game eventually blends together, and most moments fade from memory. I did the best I could to preserve the memory of my dad. The stats in the hockey encyclopedia are printed in black and white and will exist forever. But stories provide the color to a black and white world. Sadly, the stories of an entire generation of hockey players is in danger of forever being forgotten. There were many great hockey players from the 1950s and 60s who thrilled the fans in the American Hockey League and the Western League during the original Six era, who would be multimillionaires if they played today. Every player has accumulated a lifetime of moments, and all of those memories are under attack by the cruel passage of time. I have done my best to tell not only the story of my dad, but to honor an entire generation of players before they are completely forgotten. I did my best to preserve history, but sometimes I made some mistakes. Some were minor, like how I accidentally referred to the Cowboys defeating the Bills in Super Bowl 25 when it was actually the Giants with Jeff Hostetler. The biggest mistake, though, was about Jean-Guy Talbot's injury to Scotty Bowman when they were both playing juniors. There was an English version of what happened and a French version of what happened. My dad told me the English version, that Talbot broke Scotty Bowman's skull open with a vicious hit with his stick, ending his hockey career. That's the same story that Ken Dryden put in his autobiography. The French version was that the injury was accidental and his punishment was too severe. That's what former Clipper goalie Jill Boisvert told me. The truth is that Talbot did not fracture Scotty Bowman's skull. It was just a severe cut which required a lot of stitches. And the injury didn't end his career. He was playing again with the Montreal Junior Canadiens a few days later. I can try to go back like George Lucas and edit out these mistakes along with all the technical glitches, but I'm not going to. I have to admit to myself that no matter how hard I try, it's impossible to perfectly preserve history. Eventually, you have to just let it go. I wish all my memories of my dad could be saved, like how his favorite all-time television show was The Gong Show. He had a crush on J.P. Morgan and loved it when Chuck Barris danced to Jumpin' at the Woodside with Gene the Dancing Machine. Or how he carried me on his shoulders when I was a toddler because I was too tired to walk on the boardwalk in Wildwood, New Jersey. Or the time that little brat Jimmy Pagano told Bartlett, "Now get out of here," after my dad taught the preschooler how to drive his little automated car. There are a million stories like that. I wish I could preserve them all, but I can't. A horrific worldwide pandemic consumed the world in 2020. No country was affected more than the United States by the deadly coronavirus that was named COVID-19. I remember being upset in March that the NCAA basketball March Madness tournament was being canceled because my alma mater, the University of Dayton, was forecast to be a #1 seed that year. Like most people, I had no idea of the severity of the crisis that the nation was facing. Despite shutdown orders that required the public to shelter in place and close businesses and schools down across the nation, more than 1 million Americans still died during the outbreak. Because older people were at the greatest risk, until the vaccine was developed a year later, I had very little in-person contact with my parents that year. After tying the record for most wins in a season the year before, getting swept in 4 straight in the first round, the Tampa Bay Lightning were seeking redemption when the season was suspended due to COVID. However, we were all overjoyed when the NHL was somehow able to finish the season and the Tampa Bay Lightning were able to win the Stanley Cup in late September while playing in an empty arena in Canada. On July 7th, 2021, although he was unable to go to any of the games, Bartlett was able to watch from the comfort of his home all of the Lightning games as they won back-to-back championships. Because travel was being permitted and my parents were both vaccinated, my dad's granddaughter Tiffany, her husband Ryan, and their 2 children Keegan and Riley flew to Florida for a visit. Jimmy Bartlett was 89 years old. Taking care of my dad was becoming more and more difficult for my mother. He was having more and more senior moments and was beginning to have some difficulties with some routine tasks. But he never became immobile or senile. He was still the same old Bartlett in most ways. But age had definitely taken its toll. He hadn't reached the point where he needed to be in a nursing home, but I worried about how long my mom could continue to take care of him. On August 21st, 2021, my mother was hysterical. Bartlett had fallen while he was holding their little pet Yorkie, Teddy. My dad wasn't hurt, but Teddy's shoulder was dislocated. I drove with my mother to the animal emergency room while my wife stayed home with my dad. He was very upset and felt terrible about accidentally hurting Teddy. However, before we left, he cheered up when I reminded him that our friend Mike Egger, who was almost like a son to him, was coming down the following week for a visit. Late that night, I received another call from my mom. She had been in the living room watching television while Bartlett was sleeping in the back bedroom. But when she went in to check on him, he was laying on the floor unconscious. Because of COVID, my mother was unable to go to the hospital with my dad after she called 911. After a few days, he entered hospice care. My mother was greatly relieved when we saw him in hospice. He was cleaned up and shaven and was sleeping very peacefully. He wasn't in any pain, but he never regained consciousness. We didn't expect a miracle. We were just grateful that he was able to come to the end of his life without suffering. On August 27th, 2021, Jimmy Bartlett died. We didn't have a funeral. We never published an obituary. Because I was so young, I only have just the faintest of memories of my dad's hockey career. His hockey legacy never had any real impact on my life. But what made me who I am today was his role as my father. That is his true legacy. Black Bart was hockey's colorful outlaw. He didn't let anyone tell him what to do. He marched to the beat of his own drummer and often rebelled against the authority of his coaches, never afraid to speak his mind. Even though his reckless aggressiveness on the ice would drive his coaches absolutely crazy, Bartlett's willingness to fight anyone in order to protect his teammates and his exciting and entertaining style of play made him a folk hero to the fans. On paper, my dad and I have nothing in common. He was street smart and I was book smart. I was into philosophy, history, and politics, three things he couldn't care less about. But despite our differences, we were very close and he always encouraged me to pursue my dreams. My dream was to become a criminal defense attorney. But in some ways, though, I have to admit that the old man must have rubbed off on me. Bartlett always said that if you were good to the press, they would be good to you. Once I became a lawyer, the local newspaper, the St. Petersburg Times, now known as the Tampa Bay Times, found my courtroom antics to be amusing, especially my closing arguments. Because trials in real life are much slower and more boring than they are on television, I always tried to add a little bit of flair in order to add some excitement and to entertain the jury. According to the Times, in an expansive 2.5-hour closing argument during a DUI manslaughter trial, Bartlett was on a real roll. His references included the Three Stooges, Lee Harvey Oswald, Thomas Jefferson, Columbus, Magellan, Galileo, Isaac Newton, Daniel Webster, Japanese warlords, and the Revolutionary War. A subsequent molestation trial brought some of the same courtroom flair. Bartlett again mentioned Galileo to prove a point about reasonable doubt. He also mentioned Austin Powers, a song by the Four Tops, the Salem witch trials, Bill Clinton, and even Popeye of cartoon fame. Finally, he brought out a chart listing the top 10 reasons why the jurors should have a reasonable doubt. Bartlett couldn't resist a variation of a line late-night talk show host David Letterman made famous. The lawyer told the jurors, "The top 10 reasons why there's a reasonable doubt," from the home offices in Clearwater, Florida. Before I opened my own practice, I used to work at the public defender's office. The press also thought it was fun that when I was working at the PD's office, I was also the drummer for a rock band. The band was named Dillinger after the notorious bank robbing outlaw who was public enemy number one during the 1930s. But after the public defender Robert Jagger lost the election to a lawyer named Robert Dillinger, and the paper asked me what I would do if the new boss objected and had a problem with the band, I told him that if he thought our band sucked, we would just change the name of the group to Jagger. The newspaper also knew about the legend of Black Bart, that my dad was Jimmy Rocky Bartlett, the 5'9" slugger who knocked out the NHL's biggest player, Moose Vasco, with a single punch. Another time, the Times noted that it was a good thing that I didn't follow in my father's footsteps because courtrooms aren't equipped with penalty boxes. I told the paper that I have my father's aggressiveness and that he always had trouble with authority figures, and I have that attitude too. But I'm not banging people into the boards. I stuck to fighting for justice. Unlike Black Bart, the Times noted that I lacked a colorful nickname worthy of the NHL. The paper suggested that after a judge twice threatened to hold me in contempt after growing tired of my objections during a trial and my continued arguing with the court even after an adverse ruling, I should be given the nickname Steve I Object Bartlett. According to the Times, I wasn't in the group of lawyers who seeks to curry favor with the court by brown-nosing and sucking up the judges. I am unapologetically anti-authoritarian, and I love defending the rights of the underdog and fighting against the powerful. That's why I fought to improve the inhumane conditions for female inmates in the Pinellas County Jail. And I'm willing to take on anyone on behalf of my clients. I accused Tarpon Springs Police of planting evidence prior to the investigation into that city's police department by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Hell, I even once sued the mafia. I guess I was a colorful outlaw in my own way. In June 2023, the family got together to celebrate my mother, Kelly Bartlett's 80th birthday. Although we all felt the absence of my dad, The gathering reminded us that the greatest legacy a person can leave behind is a loving family. All we can do in life is to take whatever wisdom we learned from the past, blend it with our own experiences and discoveries, and in turn pass it like a torch to those who follow. 75 years after Jimmy Bartlett patrolled the blue line for his Verdun High School hockey team, Tiffany's son, Keegan Grant, his great-grandson, became a defenseman for the East Providence High School team. Go Townies! And Keegan's older sister Riley was a triple threat during her high school days. She was captain of the hockey team, the volleyball team, and the lacrosse team. Riley was the league's Lacrosse Player of the Year in both her junior and senior years, and she did it while also being a high honor student. In 2024, Riley Grant became the first member of the family to compete in the NCAA as a college student athlete when she became a midfielder for the Roger Williams University lacrosse team, while chasing her dream of helping save the planet by majoring in environmental science. Black Bart couldn't have been prouder.
Bonsoir mes amis, bonsoir.